Alright guys, welcome back to the video. So in this one we're going to be talking about dovetail jigs. So I got a comment on one of my older videos by a gentleman named Steve asking why I don't use something like the Jonathan Katz-Moses dovetail jig for most of my projects. And so the answer to that question is actually quite complex because I have very mixed feelings about these dovetail jigs, whether to use them on a project, whether not to use them, all that kind of stuff. And just overall their functionality. So first off, if you don't know what a dovetail jig is, all it is just a magnetic block of something that helps guide your saw. So as you can see here, this block that I'm holding has a few different angles on it. And so this is a 14-degree jig, and all it does is that it's got a big magnet stuck in the middle here, and it sticks to your saw and helps hold that perfect angle, as you can see there. So it is pretty helpful when you're starting out so that you can actually learn what angles you need to work with. And so the jig that I've got here is a 14-degree Veritas dovetail jig. The set also comes with a 90-degree jig. The Veritas has, I think, 3 different angles here. They've got the 14-degree, the 1:8 ratio, and the 1:6 ratio, which are kind of your 3 most common dovetail angles. And so the other jig that is very popular is the Jonathan Katz-Moses dovetail jig, which I believe is a 1:8 ratio jig. Correct me if I'm wrong there in the comments down below. But yeah, I believe it's a 1:8 ratio jig, and it does a very similar thing to these ones that I've got here. And so the way that all of these jigs work, and they have a few different, depending on which ones you get, they have a few different functionalities, but all you have to do is when you mark your line for your dovetail on your piece of wood, and so I know that I want my dovetail to have a line right there, all I'm going to do is set up my jig to be right on that line there. And in the case of these Veritas ones, which is a feature that I really like, you can just lock them right to the piece of wood with this brass knob, and they're not going to move around here, so I don't have to worry about hand holding it and that. Then you're going to take whatever saw you're planning on using for cutting your dovetail, stick it to the magnet there, and you can just kind of start cutting. So it's a really easy way to then get a very accurate cut dovetail. And so one of the big benefits of these dovetail jigs is that they're going to hold your saw mostly to that perfect angle. So again, I say mostly because depending on how rough you're being with your saw, depending on your sawing technique in general, it is going to affect how well these jigs actually work. What can end up happening is if you're using this jig and you're just going mad sawing, your blade of your saw can move around and twist, and you can really mess up your piece of wood and your jig itself. So you really got to focus on your sawing technique, keeping your saw nice and under control, just riding against the jig there. And so again, like I said, with these Veritas ones, one of the features of them is that you can lock them in place. You don't have to do up that lock. You can also go and just hold it there with your hand. But what I found is when I tried to do this is that the jig would move around on me while I was sawing, and I just found it a little bit inaccurate. Again, one of the main reasons that I went for this Veritas set is because of that locking feature, because you can just put it in place, lock that knob, and your jig isn't going anywhere. And so with these jigs, there are a few different downsides to them. They do take a little bit of extra time to set up. I do have to go and manually go in, set this jig up to my line, tighten it down, grab my saw, and start cutting. And I have to do this every single time I want to cut the next tail. I have to put my saw down, go over to the next line, lock this in place, get the saw. It just becomes a little bit repetitive, and it's just kind of an extra step that eventually you're going to kind of find annoying. Also with these jigs, there are limitations to the types of saws you can use. So the saw that comes with the Veritas set is an open back saw. Now the downside of these open back saws is that they are very flimsy like that and are quite prone to damage and just kind of being less accurate. But again, because you've got that big magnet in there, it's not a big deal. But again, most people you're going to see are not going to be cutting their dovetails with a saw like this. But it does work for a little while anyway. And because of that, this kind of saw works really well with a jig like this because you can go into any depth of wood. You're not really limited by anything, and the jig is not going to cause any problems. If we step up to a Japanese dovetail saw, you can start to see some of the limitations. So the Japanese dovetail saw have a pretty wide blade here, but then have this piece of metal on the backing here to create some rigidity in that blade so it's not moving around as much. And so this saw is a little bit better than the next saw we're going to talk about because I can get a little bit more depth on it just because it's a taller blade. And so if I'm cutting like 3/4 inch long dovetails, I will end up bottoming out this jig, so then I have to take the jig off and then continue cutting my lines down. Again, in the project that you guys are going to see coming out in a couple of weeks here, I had to do that because I decided to use this jig and this Japanese saw, and my dovetails were, I think, about 3/4 inches long. So I would start by cutting as much as I could with the jig on, then I would just finish off my lines with just freehand there. And then lastly, there is the Western style saws, which basically don't work with most of these jigs that I've seen. Again, I think the Jonathan Katz-Moses jig is a little bit narrower than the Veritas ones, but I've never actually seen it in person, so I have no way of actually knowing. But with this Veritas dovetail saw and this Veritas dovetail jig, I can get about 1/8 of an inch into the wood. So one of the benefits of this is that I can use the jig to get that perfectly straight line, and especially if you're just starting with a Western style saw, using the jig like this is actually really helpful for learning how to start the saw properly, because you always want to start a Western style saw on the push stroke so you can actually get into practice of that, because the jig will help add some support to the saw so you can practice with that. And so if I take the jig off here, this line that's in here now is perfectly perpendicular to each of these faces. I can hold my square up to it and see that it is a perfect 90 degrees from the front and the back face, which is really important. Again, one of the hardest things when cutting dovetails freehand is making sure that your saw blade is not skewed to the left or the right. You want to make sure that the saw blade is perfectly perpendicular to that front and back face. And that again is where the jig can come in kind of handy to start your cut. The only downside again, if you're using something like this Veritas jig and this Veritas saw, is that you can just make a starting line and then you have to do the rest of it freehand. So although you have a good starting line to put your saw into, you have to do the rest of this freehand, which again can be a little bit more challenging if you've only ever used the jig. So it's just again one of those things to be aware of. And so speaking of saws, let's just quickly go on a small tangent here of which saws I actually prefer. So as you can see, there is quite a big difference between the Japanese and the Western style saws. The Western style saws are a push saw and have this kind of, I don't know if it's like a pistol grip, I don't really know what to call this kind of grip on the saw, but it's a much more comfortable grip. As you can see, my hand just kind of fits in there nicely. And so the way that you cut with a Western style saw is when you push it. So as you're pushing forward, it's going to be cutting and removing material. When you're pulling backwards, it's not really going to be removing any material. On the Japanese saw, it's completely opposite. When you pull backwards, it's going to remove material, and then the handle on it is just a straight piece of wood. So what I find is when I'm using the Japanese style saws, they're just super uncomfortable for long periods of time. So because your wrist is kind of strange like that, it does give you a pretty good grip. You can still put your finger forward and you can still get a pretty good grip on this saw. This grip is not nearly as comfortable as this Western style grip. The other thing with Japanese style saws is that they're a much finer cut tooth. So I don't know what the actual TPI is on either of these saws. I think that this Veritas one is a 14 TPI, and I think that this one is around 30 or 40 TPI, something like that. And so the more teeth you have on your saw, the more teeth per inch that you have on your saw, the harder it is to actually pull through material. So sawing with the Japanese saw actually takes a lot more time. So when you're using the jig, going through and clearing out the material with the Japanese saw, I find that it's a lot slower of a cut, which can be more accurate, but there is a caveat to that, which we're going to talk about in just a second here. But having more teeth will give you a little bit cleaner of a cut, but it also takes longer. Whereas with the Western style saw, it's very easy to very quickly clear out a lot of material. And so between the two saws, you will notice a big time difference between cutting out those tails or those pins. It definitely is a lot faster to use a Western style saw because it removes material a lot faster. And so like I mentioned before, accuracy does play into this. Technically speaking, the more teeth per inch you have, theoretically the more accurate you should be able to be, because you're removing smaller amounts of material. You should be able to make minor coarse adjustments and all that with the Japanese style saw, rather than whereas with the Western style saw you can remove more material, so you're moving a lot faster, which is sometimes less accurate. Now what I found is that the Western style saw is actually way more accurate than the Japanese style saw, just when you're freehanding dovetails or even when you're using the jig. Because one of the biggest problems I've had with both this Japanese style saw and this saw that came with the Veritas jigs is that they are very flimsy. So you can see that just with my hands here, I can bend that steel, no issue, in the blade. So when you're cutting, sometimes it'll get twisted or it just moves around in the cut, and that can cause issues. Whereas on the Western style saws, this is a solid piece of plate steel. I can't move it. It doesn't really, I don't have to worry about it twisting or moving within the teeth area while I'm cutting. So again, that is one of the main reasons why I prefer these Western style saws. So purely because I prefer Western style saws is one of the reasons why I just kind of got used to not using these jigs anymore. Because again, when you're using these jigs, trying to align it to the line, hold the Western saw up to it, cut 1/8 of an inch, take the jig away, cut the rest of your dovetail, it doesn't really add enough benefit to make it worth all that extra time and effort that goes into it, and it just becomes a little bit more tedious. Whereas when I just have my saw and I just start cutting through my lines, that is a lot more enjoyable. It's not super hard. And because I have a little bit of practice cutting dovetails now, getting my saw nicely squared up along my cut here is not super challenging anymore. It definitely was when I started out, but now again, after a little bit of practice, it's not too bad. And so the other downside to using a dovetail jig is that it's kind of like riding a bike with training wheels. You can't ever really get better or faster because the jig and the time that it takes to set up the jig and keeping your saw up against that jig is what's going to be your limiting factor. So as soon as you go from using a jig to just going freehand, you are going to basically have to relearn how to cut dovetails. Because where you had this thing holding your saw at the perfect angle, you're going to have to learn how to start the saws properly, both the Western and the Japanese saws. You're going to have to learn how to hold the saw at that proper angle. You will have a little bit of muscle memory from using the jigs, but overall, it's not going to be nearly as good as if you just keep practicing doing it freehand. So eventually, I do recommend, if you are someone that is cutting dovetails often, try and get away from the jig, because you'll notice that the process is a little bit more enjoyable and does go faster, and you do sometimes get a better result by not using the jig. And so it really just comes down to a lot of the people that are, my biggest influences in the woodworking world. I don't see them using dovetail jigs to cut their dovetails. They do it freehand, and their dovetails come out just beautifully. So I just think personally that, again, if I want to get really good with cutting dovetails, I'm better off just, practicing freehand and hopefully getting really good at it over the years. So that is one of the things that I am personally working on, is just getting good at cutting dovetails freehand. And so to finish off this video, let's talk about some of the positives of these dovetail jigs and why I still occasionally use them. So I've mentioned a couple times already, there is a project that you guys are going to see in a couple weeks here where I did actually go through and use this dovetail jig to cut my dovetails. And that was purely because I wanted that to come out as perfect as absolutely possible. So using the Japanese saw here and this 14-degree dovetail jig, I went through, set it up on each of my lines, and made sure to cut those as perfectly as possible. Again, slowing it down a lot, taking my time with the Japanese saw here to cut those perfectly angled lines, because that was the whole purpose of that project. I wanted these perfect looking dovetails, and I know the best way to get those absolutely perfect looking dovetails is with the dovetail jig. So on projects where I want absolute precision with my dovetails, I definitely will always go back to using the dovetail jig, and that's a good reason to always keep one around. So one of the important points to take away from this video is that I'm not saying that you should or shouldn't use these dovetail jigs. I'm saying that you definitely need to have one of these dovetail jigs in your shop. Whether you're someone that cuts dovetails freehand right from the beginning, or you're someone that only uses a jig, having these jigs around is just a useful thing when you're cutting dovetails, because they will allow you to get that absolute precision. And so the other thing that these dovetail jigs are really good for is cleaning up the tails themselves with a chisel. So after you've cut, say you've cut all your tails using your saw freehand, it's your first time, you're just getting used to it, you can actually go back in, mount the dovetail jig wherever it needs to be to line up. Then you can just take your chisel, hold it up against that magnet will hold it at that perfect angle, and you can just slice down the inside of your dovetail to then make it the absolute perfect angle. So in case you messed up a little bit, you always have the option to go back in and make small adjustments here and there. So that again is another really big benefit to having these jigs around. And so it all depends on your personality and what project you're working on. For me personally, I will most of the time try to avoid using these jigs, but on any project where I have extremely visible dovetails, I am going to try and use a jig of some kind just to help keep my dovetails as perfect as possible. So that's things like cases, cabinetry, trunks, chests, anything like that, where the structural components are made up using dovetails. I'll probably use the jig because I want those outside joints to look as perfect as possible. On things like drawers, I'm never going to use a jig just because it's so much slower. And on drawers, I'm really just, batching out those dovetails, getting them done nice and quickly. I don't care as much about them being absolutely perfect, just that there is a dovetail there. Because it's a strong joint, it's a strong and functional joint. In the drawers, it doesn't always need to be absolutely beautiful or perfect. And so kind of my overarching opinion of these dovetail jigs is that they're definitely handy to have in your shop. But personally speaking, again, I don't like using them for the majority of the dovetail work that I do, just because they are a little bit slower and a little bit more cumbersome. But again, they will give you an absolutely perfect result if used properly for really visible joinery. So I hope you guys found this video helpful. If I missed anything, feel free to leave a question in the comments down below. And as always, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one.